Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a truly fascinating and, sometimes challenging area. It gets right to the heart of how we define evidence itself, actually. We're looking at a critical piece of writing that really unpacks a recent systematic review. This review is all about Gestalt Language Processing, or GLP, and natural language acquisition, NLA. Now, for those of you maybe new to these terms, GLP, well, it's a natural way many autistic kids learn language. Instead of single words first, they often start with whole chunks like let's go play, scripts. And then over time, they learn to break those down and mix them up. NLA, on the other hand, that's a specific clinical approach designed to support that Gestalt way of learning. Okay, so here's the thing. Our source material for this deep dive suggests something pretty provocative. It says that sometimes when you hear the phrase no evidence, it might not be just a neutral scientific finding. It could actually be a carefully built argument, maybe designed to shut down discussion or protect existing ways of doing things. So our mission today is to go behind the review, understand how these claims of absence of evidence can sometimes be, well, manufactured. What happens when evidence gets defined so narrowly that it just pushes out a lot of what we already know? Okay, let's dig into this. So our source zeroes in on this specific systematic review. It's by Bryant, Hensley, and colleagues, published in Current Developmental Disorders Reports, and made a really big claim, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A very strong claim. They essentially declare that GLP and NLA just don't have empirical support, period.
But our source says, hold on, the way they got to that conclusion, that's where the real story is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's truly eye-opening, as our source details it, is how the review basically created its own vacuum of evidence. They set the bar for what counts as evidence incredibly high, maybe even artificially high for this context. They decided to only accept randomized controlled trials, RCTs, or single-case experimental designs, SCEDs.
Right. Those are often called the gold standard in some fields. Very rigorous controlled studies.
Very rigorous, yes. But think about what that leaves out. According to our source, everything else was just off the table. Descripting studies showing patterns, nope. Long-term case studies following kids for years, excluded.
Wow.
Qualitative research, especially led by autistic people themselves, talking about your own experiences, not counted. Even practice-based evidence, what clinicians and families actually see working day-to-day in homes and clinics, also out. Single subject reports detailing progress, ignored.
So if you set up your search criteria like that,
You pretty much guarantee the outcome, don't you?
yeah,
Our source calls this an architecture of exclusion. The conclusion, no evidence located, was baked in from the start because of these incredibly narrow rules.
that analogy they used is powerful.
Oh yeah, the sieve analogy. Trying to catch fish with a sieve that lets everything, water and fish, slip through, and then declaring the ocean empty because your tool wasn't right for the job.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. By tightening that sieve, methodologically speaking, they made the evidence landscape look barren by definition. And then, our source argues, they presented this manufactured emptiness as if it were an objective discovery.
Which makes you wonder, how often that might happen elsewhere. But it wasn't just what they excluded. Our source says there was another big problem right at the start. Something about a category error.
Yes, this is absolutely crucial. The critique asks, what were they even reviewing? Because, the argument goes, they essentially collapsed two very different things into one pile. GLP, Gestalt Language Processing, that's a description of development. It's about how some kids, particularly many autistic kids, seem to naturally acquire language, starting with those whole scripts, then gradually analyzing them.
Okay, so that's the how.
Right. But then there's NLA natural language acquisition. That's a specific, often manualized clinical program. It's an intervention, a teaching approach with defined stages, designed based on GLP principles.
Ah, I see. One's the observation, the other's the application.
Precisely. And the source argues the review treated them as if they were the same thing. The analogy used is like equating all literacy instruction with, say, one specific brand of phonics program. Then, if that specific program doesn't have an RCT proving its effectiveness, you declare the whole concept of literacy instruction unsupported. It's a flawed leap in logic.
So by mixing them up, they could dismiss the broader idea of Gestalt learning just by looking for trials of one specific protocol.
That's the argument, yes. It becomes a way to sidestep the larger body of observational and descriptive evidence for GLP itself.
And then there was the issue of measurement, right? Using the wrong yardsticks. Like your swimming versus tree climbing example earlier.
Exactly that. Our source points out the review relied heavily on what are called analytic outcome measures. These are things like how well a child breaks sentences into single words, syntactic segmentation, or mean length of utterance, basically, counting words per sentence, or prompt compliance, how well they follow instructions.
Which makes sense if you assume language is built word by word analytically.
Right, but that's not what GLP is primarily about, especially in the early stages. GLP focuses on different markers of progress, like are the child scripts becoming more flexible? Are they starting to mitigate them, change parts? Is spontaneous recombination happening, taking bits of different scripts and putting them together in new ways? Is their language use becoming more contextual, more flexible?
Totally different goals, really.
Completely different. So if you measure a Gestalt learner using purely analytic metrics, you're likely to miss the actual progress they're making. It's like that track and field test for a swimmer. You're pretty much setting them up to fail according to those specific rules. The measures didn't match the theory being supposedly evaluated.
Okay, so methodological issues, measurement issues. But the critique didn't stop there, did it? It also looked at how the review handled the existing research it did mention.
Yeah. Our source uses the term tendentious handling of sources,
Mhm.
meaning sort of biased or selective interpretation.
Okay, like what?
Well, take Ann Peters' foundational work on GLP. The review apparently cited it to suggest that Peters herself saw the Gestalt analytic distinction as just provisional, maybe not even psychologically real.
Implying the whole idea was shaky from the start.
Exactly. But our source pushes back strongly on that reading. It says Peters presented her typology as an invitation for more research, specifically longitudinal studies. She urged caution against overclaiming simply because the work was new back then, not because she thought the pattern of Gestalt acquisition wasn't real. The review apparently missed that crucial nuance.
Using caution from the past to undermine the present.
Sort of.
Oh.
Another example given is how the review used a 1990 study by Tager-Flusberg and Calkins. They apparently used it to argue that echolalia repeating phrases doesn't build grammar.
Okay.
But our source points out no serious GLP proponent claims echolalia directly builds grammar like word-by-word learning does. The claim is different. It's that echolalia acts as a scaffold. It helps with meaning-making, with participating in conversations, and it provides the raw material that eventually gets broken down and recombined.
So the review was arguing against a point nobody was actually making.
That's what the critique calls straw construction with footnotes. Setting up a weak or distorted version of the argument and then knocking it down, citing sources that don't quite support the attack.
And then there was this whole section in the review about social media, tackling prevalence figures found online.
Yeah, apparently quite a bit of space was devoted to debunking inflated claims about how many kids are Gestalt learners, often citing, Facebook posts or less rigorous sources.
How did the critique view that focus?
As a rhetorical diversion.
Yeah.
Look, everyone agrees prevalence figures need to be accurate and bad citations should be corrected. The critique doesn't dispute that. But the emphasis on this, according to the source, served to shift the focus. It directs attention away from the core question. Is Gestalt language processing a real phenomenon for a significant group of autistic children, and do they benefit from supports that acknowledge it?
So by focusing on iffy Facebook claims, they make the whole GLP-NLA area seem suspect.
Exactly. It kind of poisons leaving readers doubtful about the entire paradigm without the review ever having to grapple seriously with these central clinical and developmental observations. It's a way to create skepticism by association.
Wow. Okay, and the source also highlighted some really pointed ethical arguments the review made.
Yes, this was a major point in the critique. The review apparently warned clinicians they have an ethical duty not to adopt GLP and LA.
On what grounds?
Citing potential harms like financial costs, straining, materials, and wasted clinician time if the approaches aren't proven.
Okay, that sounds like standard evidence-based practice concerns.
It does, on the surface. But the critique points out a stark imbalance, what it calls asymmetric ethical accounting. The review carefully listed potential financial or time costs for clinicians and systems. But critically, our source says it completely refused to count potential autistic harms on the other side of the ledger.
What kind of harms?
Things like the potential trauma or distress from intensive compliance-based drills, often used in other approaches. The sheer exhaustion autistic kids experience from masking or trying to communicate in ways that don't feel natural to them, or even the harm of having a potentially effective communication pathway ignored or suppressed. These significant human costs were just invisible in the review's ethical calculus. according to the source.
So the ethics focused only on system costs, not child well-being costs.
That's the argument. When interventions with known histories of causing distress still get a pass because they have RCTs, while GLP-NLA is deemed ethically risky for lacking those specific RCTs, our source suggests this points to an ethical framework more concerned with institutional self-protection and liability rather than a holistic view of the child's well-being.
And you mentioned earlier this might not be purely scientific. The critique suggests field politics are involved too.
Very much so. The source talks about the optics of conflict. It notes, for instance, that one of the lead authors of the review is a section editor for the journal where it was published, and that the author list includes researchers known to be closely aligned with applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and the verbal behavior tradition.
Which historically hasn't always meshed well with GLP ideas.
Right. Now, the review might state there were internal firewalls, but our source argues the overall impression for many in the field is one of established interests, potentially gatekeeping new or alternative approaches. It frames the review less as a neutral scientific summary and more as potentially a political act. Maybe even market protection for the approaches these researchers are associated with, all presented under the banner of objective, evidence-based caution.
Guarding the territory, so to speak.
That's the implication drawn by the critique, maintaining the status quo for certain established, often ABA-aligned services and funding streams.
And did the review acknowledge any common ground, any existing accepted practices that actually align with GLP?
That's another major point of criticism. Our source says the review largely ignored established evidence-supported practices that are actually very GLP concordant. Things like partner responsivity, really tuning in and responding to the child's lead, enhanced milieu teaching strategies, aided language modeling on AAC devices, play-based approaches that focus on natural communication growth.
These are pretty standard best practices in good therapy, aren't they?
Many would say so, and these approaches often lead to exactly the kinds of outcomes GLP describes: kids learning to mitigate scripts, combine language flexibly, use language spontaneously. So the critique argues, if these accepted methods work and produce these outcomes, then the underlying principles of GLP are already demonstrating their validity in practice, even if they don't carry the specific NLA label or have a dedicated RCT under that name.
But the review didn't connect those dots.
Apparently not. Our source describes this as choosing enclosure over genuine analysis, walling off GLP and LA as unsupported, rather than seeing the connections and overlaps with existing effective practices, keeping the categories separate to maintain the no evidence finding for the specific target.
Okay, so if that review was, as the source argues, flawed in its approach to narrow, biased handling of sources, asymmetric ethics, what should a fair review have looked like?
Well, fundamentally, a fair review would need to take a much broader perspective on what actually constitutes valid knowledge in this area. Yes, RCTs and SCDs can answer certain specific questions. They have value. But our source calls them blunt instruments for understanding something as complex, individualized, and context-dependent as autistic language development.
Because kids aren't lab rats and language isn't learned in a vacuum?
Exactly. Development is messy, individual, and deeply influenced by environment and interaction. Quantitative designs often struggle to capture that richness. So, a fair review would absolutely need to value qualitative research much more highly. Studies that explore how children use language day to day, how families see progress unfolding, how those scripts actually get used and modified in real life. Interviews, observations, narrative accounts.
Stories behind the numbers.
Precisely. Both numbers and narratives are essential pieces of the puzzle. A balanced review would integrate them, recognizing they offer different but equally important insights. It wouldn't create this hierarchy where only one type of data counts. And critically, a fair review would have to be upfront and honest about the ethical limitations of doing certain kinds of research, especially with young, potentially vulnerable children. Meaning, we generally don't and ethically probably shouldn't randomly assign children to conditions where they might be denied a communication support that seems promising just to get clean data for an RCT.
Right, the child's immediate needs come first.
They have to. So the relative scarcity of large-scale RCTs, specifically on branded GLP and LA protocols, isn't necessarily proof that the approach is ineffective or flawed. Our source actually frames this scarcity not as an evidence gap, but potentially as an ethical strength. It might reflect a field being careful, respecting children's rights, and prioritizing supportive interventions over experimental purity when communication is at stake. A fair review would acknowledge that complex ethical landscape.
So bringing this all together, what's the big takeaway for us, for listeners trying to make sense of these evidence claims?
I think the main thing is not to automatically equate a scarcity of one specific type of evidence, like RCTs, with a complete emptiness of knowledge or support. It encourages us to ask critical questions. How was evidence defined in this study or review? What methods were included? And maybe more importantly, what was excluded? And to think about how we can best learn from all the ways we gather knowledge, the rigorous quantitative studies, yes, but also the deep qualitative insights, the clinical experience, the lived experiences of autistic people themselves. Always, always keeping the well-being and the communication success of the actual children at the absolute center of the picture. Look beyond the headline to the process.
So this deep dive really suggests the review didn't necessarily prove GLP lacks evidence overall. What it might have shown, according to our source, is that the authors made specific choices tightening that sieve that guaranteed they wouldn't find certain kinds of evidence.
Exactly. And connecting it back, what gets presented as neutral, evidence-based caution can, as our source argues, function as something else, perhaps as strategic market protection or enclosure, effectively marginalizing approaches that challenge the status quo, ensuring certain established methods remain dominant. The critique frames it starkly as potentially being policy warfare dressed in academic prose.
So the next time any of us encounter that definitive claim of no evidence, maybe pause and ask, how exactly was that conclusion reached? What counted, what didn't, and why? And what might the consequences of those choices be, especially for the people in this case, children supposedly being served? Thank you for diving deep with us today. Lots to think about there. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious.